Dragons once inspired designs for flying machines. This is the hidden history of how medieval legends, those wild stories of griffins and alchemists, directly fueled real scientific breakthroughs. We often picture the Middle Ages as a time of superstition, but those fantastical tales were actually a fertile ground for innovation. Why would anyone seriously study a unicorn, and how could that possibly lead to a medical discovery? By the end of this journey, you will see mythology not as simple fantasy, but as a genuine catalyst for progress that shaped our world. We will uncover how the quest for a mythical king expanded our maps, and how the fear of a screaming plant advanced early surgery. What story from your own life started as a simple idea and became something real for these medieval thinkers? The world was not a collection of separate subjects. It was one grand, unified story written by the divine. Every leaf, every animal, and every rumored beast in a traveler's tale held a piece of the same sacred puzzle. This meant that when a scholar in a monastery library pored over a bestiary, he was not reading fantasy. He was studying natural history. A book like the Physiologus was his textbook, and its descriptions of unicorns and griffins were as valid as its accounts of lions and eagles. Each creature, real or imagined, contained a lesson. The phoenix rising from its own ashes was not just a symbol of resurrection. It was a potential clue to the hidden laws of nature itself. This worldview transformed curiosity into a spiritual duty. To investigate a legend was to seek a deeper understanding of the creator's mind. So when an alchemist read about the salamander, a creature said to be born in and immune to flame, he did not dismiss it. He saw a scientific challenge. His attempts to replicate the salamander's fire-proof nature led him to test different minerals and clays in his furnace. In doing so, he was not practicing magic. He was conducting early materials science, accidentally discovering compounds that could withstand extreme heat and paving the way for better forges and ceramics. This unique blend of faith, folklore, and fledgling experimentation created an environment where the line between a myth and a hypothesis was beautifully blurred. The impossible was not a closed door, but an invitation to look closer. The Griffin's legend reveals a profound truth about discovery. A story can act as a map even when the destination is unknown. In the vast Gobi Desert, merchants traveling the Silk Road would have stumbled upon extraordinary sights. Littering the ground were enormous, bleached skeletons unlike any living animal. They had beaks like eagles and bodies that suggested both a lion and a bird. The local people had a name for the creature these bones represented, a fierce guardian of gold. They called it the Griffin. This was not a deliberate lie, but a brilliant human attempt to make sense of tangible evidence. The fossils of the Protoceratops dinosaur, with its distinctive frill and beak, were the physical reality. The Griffin was the narrative that gave that reality meaning. This fusion of bone and fable ignited a quest. When reports of these mythical beasts reached Europe, they did not just fuel heraldry and art. They sent curious minds on expeditions. These early naturalists, armed with stories instead of scientific journals, ventured into those same deserts. They were searching for a legend, but what they began to do was practice a very early form of paleontology. They observed, they collected, and they tried to reconcile the physical world with the stories they had been told. In this way, the pursuit of a fantasy directly led to the foundational work of a real science. The Griffin was the hypothesis, and the dinosaur bones were the data waiting to be correctly interpreted. This demonstrates a powerful pattern. Our misinterpretations are not always dead ends. sometimes they are the only paths we have into a new and uncharted territory. The fear of being wrong can paralyze progress, but the medieval mind, unburdened by our modern categories, was free to follow a story wherever it led. And sometimes that story leads you right to the skeleton of a dinosaur. This same blend of myth and practical investigation saved lives in a far more direct way. On the banquet tables of kings and popes, a single piece of cutlery could mean the difference between life and death. The unicorn's horn, known as an alicorn, was believed to sweat or change color in the presence of poison. A ruler would sip wine from a cup made from this precious material, trusting it to neutralize any venom within. These were not mere ceremonial objects. They were functional, life-saving devices employed in a world rife with political intrigue and assassination. The fervent belief in the alicorn's power created a continuous, high-stakes experiment. Every meal was a new trial, and survival was the ultimate data point. While the horn itself, often a narwhal tusk or fossilized mammoth tooth, possessed no inherent magical properties, the rigorous process it inspired was everything. This was the messy, real-world birth of forensic toxicology. The methodology was being established through sheer necessity. People were actively testing a substance against toxins and observing the results, even if their initial premise was flawed. This practice extended to other objects like the bezoar, a stone from an animal's gut also thought to be an antidote. The quest for a mythical cure, all driven by fear and faith, forced a systematic, empirical approach to medicine. It shifted the question from whether a legend was true to whether an object actually worked. That shift in thinking, from trusting a story to demanding proof from the physical world, is the very foundation of modern science. The unicorn's horn was a phantom, but the lives saved by the cautious habits it created were wonderfully real. Yet the most profound transformation was happening not in deserts or banquet halls, but in the smoky confines of the alchemist's workshop. Alchemy is often dismissed as a fool's quest for gold, but this misses its true nature. It was a grand, philosophical system driven by a powerful narrative. The legendary Philosopher's Stone was the ultimate goal, a symbol of purification and perfection that pushed these early experimenters to their limits. To create this mythical substance, they performed thousands of procedures. They distilled, they sublimated, they crystallized. In their relentless pursuit, figures like Jabir ibn Hayyan and Paracelsus were not just mystics. They were pioneering chemists. Their quest for a storybook object led them to accidentally discover potent mineral acids, pure alcohol, and revolutionary new alloys. They even had to invent the very tools for the job, designing essential equipment like the alembic for distillation and the retort for heating substances. Their work was shrouded in allegory. Texts spoke of a chemical wedding, of matter dying and being reborn. This was not mere poetry. It was a coded language describing real, observable chemical processes. The story of transformation forced them to watch their experiments with incredible care, to record every color change and every reaction with meticulous detail. This systematic, experiment-driven pursuit, born from a powerful myth, established the fundamental rules of empirical investigation. It created the laboratory itself as a place of discovery. The methods they perfected, inspired by a legend, would later be stripped of their mystical language and refined by figures like Robert Boyle, forming the bedrock of modern chemistry. The stone itself was never found, but the process of searching for it gave us something far more valuable, the very means to understand the material world. Even the most terrifying stories could hold a kernel of practical truth. Deep in the soil grew the mandrake root, a plant whose twisted, human-like form was said to scream when pulled from the earth, a cry that could kill any who heard it. This was not just a campfire tale to frighten children. It was a serious warning that shaped how an entire generation of healers approached their work. The elaborate harvesting ritual, using a dog to pull the root while a person covered their ears, seems like pure superstition, yet it was born from a very real and observable danger. The mandrake contains powerful tropane alkaloids, compounds that can cause vivid hallucinations, dangerous delirium, and even fatal poisoning through skin contact or airborne dust. The screaming root was a narrative wrapper for a genuine biological hazard. This legendary fear, however, did not stop its use. It enforced a strict, cautious methodology. Herbalists treating the plant with the respect one would afford a venomous serpent were compelled to study its properties with extreme care. They documented how, in precisely controlled doses, the very toxins that could kill a person also offered profound medical benefits. The mandrake became a key ingredient in early surgical anesthetics and potent pain relief tonics. A patient could undergo a painful procedure because a surgeon had learned to harness the sleep-inducing power of a mythical screaming plant. The detailed, if fantastical, illustrations in medieval herbals showing the root's human-like shape were more than just folklore. They represent some of the first systematic attempts to classify a plant based on its appearance and its effects on the human body. This was the beginning of botanical pharmacology. The myth of the mandrake's deadly scream established what we would now call a safety protocol. It forced a rigorous, measured approach to handling powerful biological agents, demonstrating that a narrative of danger could directly lead to more effective and careful medical practices. The fear was imaginary, but the life-saving caution it inspired was utterly real. Even the sky was not the limit for a mind fueled by myth. The great Gothic cathedrals, those stone forests reaching for the clouds, began as a story. Medieval Europe was consumed by the legend of a heavenly Jerusalem, a city of gold and light described in sacred texts. Master builders were not merely constructing churches. They were attempting to physically recreate that divine legend on earth, to build a house for God so magnificent it would humble every human who entered. This legendary ambition demanded engineering that defied all previous experience. How do you make stone appear weightless? How do you hold up a wall that is mostly window? The answer was born from this very struggle, the flying buttress. This elegant, arched stone arm reached out from the outside of the building, shouldering the immense weight of the vaulted ceiling and freeing the walls from their load-bearing duty. It was a revolutionary solution, an architectural leap driven by a spiritual goal. Those newly liberated walls could then be filled with vast panels of stained glass, transforming sunlight into 1,000-colored stories and bathing the interior in an ethereal, otherworldly glow. The cathedral was not just a building, it was a machine for generating awe, a physical portal to the legendary city it sought to emulate. But this vision required more than faith. It demanded precision. The master builders, often guided by mystical numerical symbolism found in Scripture, performed complex geometric calculations to ensure their stone prayers would not collapse. They became accidental mathematicians and material scientists, testing the strength of different quarries' limestone and inventing new types of mortar. The sheer challenge of lifting massive stones hundreds of feet into the air led to the invention of revolutionary treadwheel cranes and intricate lifting devices. They developed template-based construction, using wooden patterns to ensure every sculpted stone would fit perfectly, a precursor to modern mass production. Every aspect of building these legendary spaces forced innovation. The quest to touch the divine, to make a story real in stone and glass, reshaped the entire discipline of architecture. It proved that our most ambitious dreams, even those woven from myth, can compel us to build a new reality. But a legend's power is not confined to objects or buildings. It can also draw an entire continent across a map. For centuries, Europe felt isolated and besieged until a story arrived that promised a powerful ally. A letter copied and spread through every court and monastery told of Prester John, a Christian king of immense piety and wealth ruling a miraculous kingdom somewhere in the distant east. His domain was a place of wonders, home to the fountain of youth and rivers that flowed over gemstones. This was not just a fable, it was a geopolitical fantasy that offered hope. If this king and his massive army were real, he could be the ally Europe desperately needed, a second front against rival powers. That single, forged document created a goal so compelling it overrode the terrors of the unknown. Monarchs and popes began sending envoys eastward, asking every ruler they met if he was the legendary Prester. They never found him, of course, but the search itself was transforming the world. The most systematic pursuit was launched by Portugal's Prince Henry the Navigator. His ships sailed south down the coast of Africa with two official missions. One was to find a sea route to the spice markets of Asia. The other, equally vital command was to locate the kingdom of Prester John and secure his alliance. Every new bay, every river mouth they charted was scrutinized for any sign of the legendary Christian king. They were navigating by a story, using a myth as their compass. And with every mile of coastline they meticulously mapped, the vague, monstrous creatures that once populated the edges of the world were replaced with accurate headlands, trading posts, and real cultures. The dream of a fictional kingdom funded the caravels, paid the sailors, and provided the moral justification to venture beyond the known. The quest for Prester John did not just expand the map. It created the very idea that the unknown could and should be systematically explored and documented. A phantom king, dreamed up in a letter, became the catalyst that launched the ships which would forever connect the globe. Within the quiet scriptorium, a monk's quill did more than copy tales. It was building a database. The medieval bestiary was not merely a picture book of oddities. It was the world's first organized attempt to classify all animal life. These illuminated manuscripts presented a unified world, where the behaviors of a common badger held as much instructional value as the legend of a fire-breathing salamander. Each entry followed a consistent pattern, a proto-scientific method of observation, description, and interpretation. The bonacon, a mythical beast said to defend itself with burning dung, stood alongside surprisingly accurate accounts of bears hibernating and beavers building dams. The bestiaries' structure grouped creatures by their realm, the beasts of the land, the birds of the air, and the fish of the sea. This created a foundational framework, a mental filing cabinet for the natural world that would later be refined by scientists like Linnaeus into formal taxonomy. The real genius of these books, however, lay in their mandatory moral lesson. Every animal, real or imagined, was a key to a deeper truth. The pelican, depicted piercing its own breast to feed its young with blood, was not just a bird. It was an allegory for Christ's sacrifice. This spiritual requirement forced the reader into a state of intense observation. To unlock the divine message, one had to study how the animal lived, how it fought, and how it died. This habit of seeking profound meaning in mundane behavior cultivated a powerful instinct for inquiry. It trained an entire scholarly tradition to look closely at nature and ask, what is really happening here and what can it teach us? By treating the barnacle goose, believed to grow on trees, with the same scholarly seriousness as the lion, these books made the entire natural world a subject worthy of meticulous study. They were flawed, yes, filled with hearsay and fantasy, but they established a systematic approach to life itself. That impulse to catalogue, to compare, and to learn from every creature, no matter how strange, was the vital seed from which the rigorous science of biology would eventually grow. A flawed map is still better than no map at all, and the Bestiary provided the first crucial chart for a continent of life waiting to be discovered. Perhaps the most intimate of all these quests was the search for a cure for time itself. The legend of the Fountain of Youth was not just a traveler's tale. It was a biological fantasy that gave shape to our deepest fear, the fear of growing old and dying. When explorers like Ponce de Leon waded into the swamps of Florida, they were not merely following a rumor. They were testing a hypothesis, one that promised the body could be reset, that decay was not inevitable. This was not a fringe idea. The very real letters describing the kingdom of Prester John specifically mentioned such a fountain within his lands, placing this dream of rejuvenation on the map of the possible. This powerful narrative gave alchemists and physicians a monumental new purpose. Their goal was no longer just to transmute lead into gold, but to transform an aging body into a youthful one. The search for the elixir of life became the ultimate medical challenge. To achieve it, they turned to their furnaces and alembics, perfecting the art of distillation. In their quest to capture the essence of life, they isolated pure alcohol, which they called aqua vitae, the water of life. This was not initially for drinking. It was a solvent, a preservative, a base for extracting the vital principles from plants and minerals. They began creating the first tinctures and concentrated herbal extracts, the direct ancestors of modern liquid medicines and pharmaceuticals. The Fountain of Youth was a phantom, but the systematic experimentation it inspired was utterly real. It forced these early researchers to think in terms of prevention, not just cure. They began writing detailed regimens, advising on diet, exercise, and mental well-being to prolong a healthy life. This was a radical shift from simply treating disease to actively managing health. The myth pushed medicine to ask a new and profound question. What are the actual mechanisms of aging within the human body, and can we intervene? That question, first sparked by a story about a magical spring, continues to drive the multi-billion-dollar field of gerontology and anti-aging research today. We are still testing that same hypothesis, only now with cellular biology and genetic science. The fountain was never found, but the relentless human desire to find it gave us something just as precious, the entire framework for investigating how to live longer, healthier lives. The stars themselves were not just points of light, they were characters in a cosmic drama that dictated the fate of kings and the health of nations. This deep conviction in astrology, that the planets and stars directly shaped events on Earth, created an urgent, practical need for better data. A monarch would not go to war or sign a treaty without consulting his astrologers, who in turn demanded the most precise charts possible. This was not a matter of abstract curiosity. It was a high-stakes requirement of statecraft and medicine. The pressure to cast an accurate horoscope funded the creation of magnificent observatories and pushed scholars to design ever more sophisticated instruments. The astrolabe, an intricate brass model of the sky, became a masterwork of engineering, allowing a user to calculate the position of the sun and stars with remarkable precision. Similarly, the armillary sphere, a skeleton of metal rings representing celestial circles, was not a decorative ornament. It was a vital tool for visualizing and predicting the complex dance of the planets. In places like the Mandrake Observatory, teams of astronomers worked under the patronage of rulers who believed in the power of the stars. Their primary mission was astrological, yet the planetary tables they produced, like the Alchemic tables, achieved a level of mathematical accuracy that would echo through the centuries, directly informing the work of Copernicus as he formulated his heliocentric model. The guiding narrative was one of a connected universe, a belief that the macrocosm of the heavens was a perfect mirror of the microcosm of human life. This holistic vision, though rooted in legend, made the entire cosmos a single, coherent system worthy of the most intense scrutiny. The quest to read the destinies written in the stars, a pursuit we now dismiss as superstition, was the very engine that drove humanity to map the heavens with ruthless accuracy. It was this legendary framework that gathered the painstaking observations, invented the precise tools, and developed the mathematical models that would one day allow a new generation of thinkers to see the same stars not as divine arbiters, but as suns and worlds governed by physical laws. The story of their influence was the catalyst that gave us the means to discover their true nature. A sword that could heal the very wound it created sounds like the ultimate paradox. Yet this legend of a self-curing weapon, like the famed Spear of Destiny, was more than a story. It posed a profound medical question that haunted every battlefield surgeon. Why did some soldiers die from a clean slash while others succumbed to a minor puncture that later swelled with pus and fever? The legend suggested the answer lay not in the body, but in the blade itself. Perhaps a special metal or a divine blessing upon the weapon could prevent the rot that so often followed an injury. This search for a magical property in steel led surgeons down a path of grim experimentation. If a blade could be imbued with a healing essence, how might they replicate it? They began treating their own instruments before amputation, cleansing them with wine or strong vinegar. They poured these same liquids into open wounds, and they seared flesh with hot irons or boiling oil to seal it. These were agonizing procedures, born from a complete misunderstanding of germs, but they were not random acts of cruelty. They were systematic, if brutal, attempts at sterilization. The narrative of the magical sword kept the problem of wound infection vividly alive in the medical imagination for generations. It created a continuous thread of inquiry, a stubborn refusal to accept that death from a minor wound was simply fate. Each cauterized limb and each cleaned blade, though based on a false premise, was a data point. It was a slow, painful accumulation of practical knowledge about the visible benefits of cleanliness. The legend itself was a phantom, but the relentless human drive to solve the puzzle it presented directly paved the way for the moment a surgeon would finally realize the enemy was not in the sword, but in the invisible world teeming upon it. That conceptual leap from a magical weapon to microscopic organisms would one day revolutionize all of medicine. A king's throne could move on its own, ascending a staircase without a single servant's touch. This was the legend of King Solomon's mechanical court, a story that did not remain confined to parchment. In workshops from Baghdad to Constantinople, engineers took these tales as a direct challenge. They looked at the mythical golden maidens forged by the god Vulcan, said to serve ambrosia, and asked a revolutionary question: could we build that? The answer was a resounding yes, and it was powered not by magic but by water, weights, and intricate gear trains. Figures like the brilliant engineer Al-Jazari did not see a divide between legend and machinery. His famous elephant clock was a masterpiece of this philosophy. Every hour, a complex sequence unfolded. A driver atop the elephant figure would move, a bird would chirp, and a ball would drop into a serpent's mouth. This was not merely a timekeeping device. It was a programmable spectacle, a narrative told through the precise movement of levers and hydraulic pressure. Each automated figure served a purpose within a larger story, blending time, astronomy, and mythology into a single, mesmerizing performance. These automata were the birth of robotics. They explored the core principles we still use today. The careful arrangement of cams and gears was a form of physical programming, dictating a sequence of actions. The use of water reservoirs and floats created simple feedback systems that regulated the machine's timing and movement. The entire assembly demonstrated sophisticated power transmission, taking a single source of energy and distributing it to multiple functions. The dream of an artificial being, a servant made of metal and ingenuity, provided a goal so compelling it pushed the mechanics of the age to their absolute limits. This was not idle tinkering. It was the foundational work of automation, proving that our most enduring stories of artificial life have been, for centuries, the very blueprints for our technological future. A king's hunger for gold could fund 1,000 experiments. The legendary Philosopher's Stone was more than a spiritual quest. It was the single greatest economic driver for early science. Patrons from emperors to merchant princes poured fortunes into alchemical workshops, not because they believed in mystical transformation, but because they desperately needed a financial one. A successful transmutation meant limitless wealth, the power to pay armies and erase national debts overnight. This raw economic pressure turned smoky laboratories into the world's first fully funded research and development centers. Alchemists were given a blank check for equipment, for assistance, and for the most expensive materials they could request. With this financial backing, they could move beyond simple curiosity. They established systematic research programs, methodically testing thousands of different ores, acids, and mineral combinations in furnaces pushed to their limits. This relentless, well-funded search for one mythical object generated an avalanche of accidental discoveries. In his quest to distill the essence of life from human urine, the alchemist Brand accidentally isolated a mysterious substance that glowed with an eerie green light. He had discovered the element phosphorus. Other funded experiments led to purer forms of antimony, new methods for producing potent mineral acids like nitric and hydrochloric acid, and revolutionary improvements in glassmaking that resulted in clearer, stronger laboratory glassware. The economic promise of the stone forced an industrial scale of experimentation. Kings demanded stronger steel for their cannons and lighter alloys for their armor, and the alchemists, funded by the same dream of gold, delivered by refining metallurgical techniques. They learned to control the carbon content in iron, creating more resilient and deadly weapons. They developed new types of ceramic crucibles that could withstand higher temperatures, allowing them to melt and mix previously unworkable metals. Every failed attempt to create gold added another brick to the foundation of modern chemistry and materials science. The data they collected on how substances react under heat and pressure, how to purify them through crystallization and distillation, became the essential toolkit for the entire chemical industry that followed. So the next time you use a smartphone with its chemically strengthened glass screen, or drive a car made from advanced alloys, remember this: the material world you take for granted was largely built by the relentless, well-funded pursuit of a legend. The stone was a fantasy, but the economic engine it created was powerfully, undeniably real, proving that sometimes the most practical advancements are born from our most impractical dreams. The soft scratch of a quill was the sound of progress being saved. In the hushed light of a monastic scriptorium, a monk bent over a sheet of vellum was doing far more than copying prayers. He was a data preservation specialist, and his monastery was a server farm for the entire knowledge of the ancient world. His sacred duty was to save every text he could find from the decay of time, and this included manuscripts we would classify as engineering manuals, medical textbooks, and agricultural science. He copied the architectural principles of Vitruvius, detailing how to construct stable aqueducts and durable buildings. He reproduced the natural histories of Pliny the Elder, with their observations on geology and animal behavior. This was not a passive act of transcription. It was an active, critical engagement with the material. In the margins, the monk would add his own notes, his glosses. He might sketch a clearer diagram for a water-lifting device described in the text, or he might write a correction based on his own experience managing the monastery's farm, noting which Roman crop rotation technique actually worked in the colder northern soil. The monastery itself was a living laboratory, a complex economic engine with its own mills, forges, infirmaries, and extensive lands. The practical wisdom gained from running this micro-society was constantly being cross-referenced with the ancient knowledge on the page. The Scriptorium became a unique intellectual hub where the legendary wisdom of Greece and Rome was systematically organized, tested, and fused with the hard-won practical wisdom of the medieval world. This was a continuous, quiet revolution in information technology. The religious mandate to preserve knowledge, a divine instruction against the darkness of forgetting, ensured that the fragile seeds of classical science and the bold sprouts of medieval ingenuity survived wars, plagues, and the collapse of empires. These meticulously copied and annotated manuscripts, stored safely in library niches, were a time capsule waiting for the future. They held the technical blueprints that Renaissance thinkers would later crack open, allowing them not to start from scratch, but to stand on the shoulders of giants they didn't even know were there. Sometimes the most fearsome monsters are the ones you cannot see. Deep within the earth, a miner's candle would suddenly gutter and die, or a canary would fall silent in its cage. Long before anyone understood the chemistry of carbon dioxide or methane, these unexplained deaths had a name. People called it the Basilisk, this legendary serpent king, said to kill with a single glance or a puff of its breath, was the perfect personification of an invisible, odorless threat. When a well-digger was struck down without a mark on his body, or when a group of miners entered an old tunnel and never returned, the basilisk provided the only logical explanation. It was not a failure of observation, but a triumph of narrative reasoning. The legend gave a tangible shape to a formless danger, creating a framework for fear that was far more effective than an abstract warning about bad air. This story directly informed a life-saving ritual. Before descending into a mine shaft or a newly dug well, a worker would lower a caged bird or a lit lantern ahead of him. If the animal died or the flame went out, the presence of the basilisk was confirmed. The space was not entered. This was not mere superstition. It was a rigorous, repeatable safety test. The legend of the basilisk had essentially codified the world's first protocol for atmospheric hazard detection. It forced a precautionary principle upon dangerous work, creating a simple binary rule that anyone could follow, regardless of their literacy or scientific training. If the candle lives, you may proceed. If it dies, the basilisk guards this place. This mythical beast, born from a need to explain the unexplainable, became a powerful mental tool that saved countless lives. It demonstrated that a story could act as a functional substitute for a chemical formula, guiding practical action long before the underlying science was ever discovered. The basilisk was a fiction, but the deaths it prevented were wonderfully, tangibly real. A map filled with sea serpents was not an admission of ignorance, but a declaration of intent. The great medieval Mappa Mundi presented a world where every blank space was an invitation for a story. Cartographers populated the vast, unexplored oceans with leviathans and whirlpools, not because they believed they were literally there, but because they were using the best information they had. A sailor's tale of a giant tentacle was a data point. It marked a region of perceived danger, a place where the sea behaved strangely or where currents were unpredictable. This fear of legendary beasts like the kraken was a powerful practical motivator. To avoid these charted terrors, sailors were forced to venture further from known coastlines, pushing them to rely less on landmarks and more on the stars and mathematics. The terror of a mythical monster directly spurred the refinement of celestial navigation and the complex mathematics of dead reckoning, the very skills needed to cross open oceans safely. They were not running from fantasy, they were navigating around very real human anxiety, and in doing so, they were learning to master the sea itself. More persistent than any monster was the dream of an island just over the horizon. For centuries, maps featured the elusive High Brassel, a ringed island cloaked in mist or scent. Brendan's Isle, a paradise discovered by a saint. These were not cartographic errors, they were destinations. A ship's captain, armed with a map that placed a legendary isle in the empty Atlantic, had a tangible goal. He would sail for weeks, his crew scanning the horizon because the map said something should be there. This quest for a phantom provided the commercial and spiritual justification for voyages that would otherwise be deemed too risky or expensive. And when they failed to find High Brassel, they often found something else entirely. A ship blown off course while searching for St. Brendan's Isle might instead stumble upon the real volcanic peaks of the Azores. Another, determined to find the 7 cities of gold said to be on a mythical island, would carefully chart the coastline of the Canary Islands. Each returning ship brought back a captain's log, filled with new soundings and coastal sketches. The cartographer, upon hearing these reports, would take his quill and hesitantly scratch out the fanciful illustration of the mythical island. In its place, he would draw the first rough, accurate outline of a new, real landmass. The legend was erased, but the knowledge it compelled them to gather remained, permanently enriching the map. This cycle of seeking fiction to uncover fact is the hidden engine of exploration. We are often at our most discoverous when we are chasing a dream, and the empty spaces on the map shrink fastest when we are brave enough to fill them first with stories. Even a failed experiment can burn a path to discovery when you are chasing a legend. The salamander, an ordinary amphibian, carried an extraordinary reputation. It was said to be born in flame and immune to its touch, a living paradox that defied the most fundamental laws of nature. Alchemists, taking this claim at its word, decided to put it to the test. They gathered the small, moist-skinned creatures and cast them into their furnaces. The result was immediate and tragic. The animals were consumed, not born, in the fire. This was a critical failure, a moment where a beloved story collided with brutal, observable fact. But instead of abandoning the legend, these early investigators were forced to think more creatively. They asked a new and more profound question. If the animal itself is not fireproof, then what in the world could possibly have inspired such a persistent and specific story? Their search shifted from biology to mineralogy. They began examining stones found near volcanic vents, materials that had been baked in the Earth's own furnace for millennia. It was here they discovered a strange, fibrous rock. When they teased apart its threads, they could weave them into a cloth, and when they held this cloth in a flame, it did not burn. They called this substance asbestos, a name that literally means unquenchable. They had found the real salamander. It was not an animal born of fire, but a mineral that defied it. This new material was immediately put to use, woven into wicks for eternal temple lamps and shrouds for cremations, allowing priests to retrieve pure ashes. Centuries later, this same discovery would be woven into the protective gear of firefighters, allowing them to walk into infernos. The legend of the fireproof creature was wrong, but the relentless curiosity it ignited uncovered a truth far more valuable. It proved that a story does not need to be factually correct to be scientifically fruitful. sometimes the most important step forward is the one you take after your first hypothesis has gone up in smoke. That same allegorical lens, trained on scripture and story, was turned directly upon the natural world. For the medieval scholar, the rustling of leaves or the path of a comet was not a random event. It was a line of text in a grand, divinely authored book, and every phenomenon contained a hidden lesson waiting to be decoded. This wasn't just a poetic notion. It was a rigorous intellectual practice. When a monk interpreted the story of Jonah and the whale as an allegory for Christ's death and resurrection, he was performing a specific mental exercise. He was making a hypothesis. The surface narrative, he reasoned, could not be the entire truth. There must be a deeper, symbolic meaning concealed within it. This exact same cognitive machinery was activated when a natural philosopher like Robert Grosseteste observed a beam of light passing through a glass of water. He saw the bending of the light, the way it split into colors, and he asked the same fundamental question he would ask of a biblical parable: what is the hidden truth here? The surface appearance is not the whole story. There is an underlying principle governing this behavior. Grosseteste, and later his student Roger Bacon, argued with powerful conviction that to truly honor God, one must diligently study his work. They championed the idea that nature itself was the primary text, and that observation and experiment were the proper methods for reading it. This allegorical framework gave empirical investigation its first and most powerful justification. It transformed the act of questioning the physical world from a potentially heretical doubt into a pious, even holy, duty. The quest for the hidden cause behind a falling apple or a floating piece of wood was now a spiritual endeavor. It was the search for God's signature written into the laws of creation. This cultural shift created an environment where looking beyond the obvious was not just permitted, but celebrated. It established a pattern of inquiry, a relentless habit of asking what lies beneath, that would become the very heartbeat of the scientific method. The stories trained them to look for the moral. The world challenged them to find the mechanism, and in that crucial transition, the method of science was born from the mind of faith. A ghostly army thundered across the medieval sky, a cacophony of spectral hounds and riders that announced not just terror, but a change in the weather itself. The legend of the Wild Hunt was far more than a fireside scare. It was humanity's first dramatic attempt to give a name and a face to the chaotic violence of the atmosphere. When people heard that unearthly roar in the wind or saw strange, shimmering lights in a brewing storm, they weren't just witnessing random events. They were seeing the hunt pass overhead, a narrative that personified the raw power of nature. This story provided a crucial framework for understanding. It connected disparate clues into a single, predictable sequence. The sudden silence of the birds, the way the cattle huddled together, the specific bruised purple color of the clouds rolling in. These weren't just isolated signs. They were the portents of the hunt's approach, a collective system for reading the environment. This myth compelled entire villages to become keen observers. They learned that a certain formation of high, wispy clouds, which we now call cirrus, often meant the wild riders would arrive with a storm within a day or two. They noted how a sudden drop in pressure made the air feel heavy and electric, a sensation they attributed to the nearness of the spectral host. By creating this cause and effect story, the legend organized a vast array of sensory data into a usable forecast. It was a qualitative, experience-based meteorology. The physics of the jet stream or the science of auroras were centuries away from being understood, but the need to predict the hunt's fury forced people to catalog patterns with remarkable care. The story itself became a mnemonic device, a way to remember that when the wind sounds like a howling pack and the sky turns a sickly green, It is time to secure the shutters and bring the livestock inside. The riders were imaginary, but the lives saved by the practical wisdom their story encoded were profoundly real. This demonstrates a profound truth about our relationship with the unknown. We will always first explain the world through stories, and sometimes those very stories teach us how to see the patterns that later become science. A master glassmaker's secret formula was worth more than gold. Inside the tightly guarded workshops of medieval guilds, legendary techniques were treated like state secrets. These were not mere tricks of the trade, but the cumulative result of generations of painstaking experimentation. The process of creating the radiant blue for a cathedral window, for instance, was a precise alchemy. It required a specific grade of cobalt ore, mined from a particular region, mixed with potash and silica in an exact ratio, and then fired in a kiln at a temperature that had to be held within a narrow margin for hours. A single mistake in the recipe or the firing would result in a dull, muddy color, or worse, a shattered, worthless pane. This hard-won knowledge was the guild's most valuable asset. The oath of secrecy sworn by an apprentice was not just about protecting a business monopoly. It was a mechanism for preserving a fragile chain of technological transmission. By elevating a technical process to the status of a legendary secret, the guild ensured that this complex empirical knowledge would be passed down intact, refined by each generation, but never lost. The same principle applied to the mysterious art of forging Damascus steel. The swirling, watery patterns on the blades were not just decorative. They were the visual signature of a microstructure that gave the steel incredible strength and flexibility. The secret lay in the source of the iron ore from India, known as Wootz steel, and a specific multi-stage process of heating, hammering, and controlled cooling that modern metallurgists are still trying to perfectly decode. The legend of the master's secret formula created a culture of incremental, practical innovation. These guilds were the research and development labs of their age, where the relentless pursuit of a legendary ideal, the perfect blue, the unbreakable sword, the pigment that would never fade, drove technological progress forward. We still look upon the stained glass of Chartres or a genuine Damascus blade with a sense of wonder, precisely because the legendary secrets of their creation compelled craftsmen to achieve a level of perfection that narrative alone made possible. A mountain itself could be hollowed out for the promise of a city made of gold. The legend of El Dorado did not begin with Spanish conquistadors, but grew from a deep medieval conviction that somewhere beyond the known world lay kingdoms of unimaginable mineral wealth. This story was not a passive fantasy, it was an economic engine. The belief that a single, legendary strike was possible justified immense investments in the most dangerous and expensive enterprise of the age, deep mining. To reach the gold they believed was there, engineers had to solve fundamental problems. How do you power massive hammers to crush tons of quartz and ore? The answer was a revolution in hydraulics, the overshot water wheel. This was not the small, creaking wheel of a rural mill. This was heavy industry, with wheels often 3 stories tall, capturing the full weight and flow of a river to drive a relentless battery of iron-shod stamps. The thunder of these hammers, powered by a legend, echoed through mountain valleys, pulverizing rock on an unprecedented scale. But the deeper the miners dug, chasing the phantom vein, the more formidable the obstacles became. Tunnels flooded with groundwater and deadly, unmoving air, what they called bad damp, would pool in the depths. The quest for El Dorado funded the solution. Elaborate systems of chain pumps, operated by teams of men or horses, were devised to lift water hundreds of feet to the surface. Even more clever were the ventilation systems, where giant bellows at the surface forced fresh air down one shaft, while a second parallel tunnel acted as a chimney, drawing the stale, poisonous air out. These were not minor improvements. They were monumental feats of engineering, all born from the need to follow a story into the earth. The Golden City remained a mirage, but the powerful pumps and ventilation technologies developed to find it allowed humanity to tap into real mineral deposits that had been forever out of reach. The legend provided the capital and the courage to turn mining from a surface scratch into a deep, systematic science. A quiet revolution was brewing not in workshops or on ships, but within the stone lecture halls of new universities. These institutions in Paris, Oxford, and Bologna became the first places where legendary knowledge was forced to sit for an examination. The core curriculum itself was a training ground for this new kind of thinking. Students first mastered the trivium, the arts of grammar, logic, and rhetoric. They learned how to dissect an argument, identify a fallacy, and construct a coherent case. Then they moved to the quadrivium, the mathematical arts of arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. This education armed them with a powerful toolkit, one they would immediately apply to the world's great texts. A student would read Aristotle's detailed observations of animal anatomy right alongside a Bestiaries' fantastical entry on the Bonacon. The contradiction was not ignored, it was the entire point of the lesson. The classroom transformed into a formal disputation, a structured debate where a student might be assigned to defend the proposition that a phoenix could truly be reborn from its own ashes. His opponent would have to attack the idea using the rules of logic and any available evidence from natural philosophy. Could such a process violate the principle that matter cannot be created from nothing? Was there any reliable witness to such an event? These were not abstract games. They were exercises in applying systematic doubt to every claim, no matter how ancient or revered its source. This academic environment created a powerful new filter for knowledge. A story could no longer stand on its own authority alone. To be accepted, it now had to withstand a gauntlet of logical scrutiny and, ideally, find some support in the observable world. The university became a crucible where narrative was first subjected to the rigorous communal testing that defines science. It was here that the slow, monumental shift began, a move away from trusting an ancient author simply because he was ancient, and toward trusting a conclusion because it had survived a collective and reasoned challenge. A glowing shape would sometimes cut through the jungle night, a living ember that defied every known rule of nature. For the people of Papua New Guinea, this was the ropen, a legendary flying beast that carried its own light. To European ears, such tales were pure fantasy, the kind of traveler's exaggeration used to fill blank spaces on a map. Yet this specific story held a kernel of tangible truth, a perfectly accurate description of a real and rare phenomenon called bioluminescence. The legend itself became a kind of field guide. It told naturalists what to look for, training their eyes to recognize the possibility of a large creature producing its own living light. Without this cultural memory, a scientist encountering a deep-sea anglerfish for the first time might have dismissed his own eyes. But because stories of the ropen and its kind had persisted for generations, the idea already had a home in the human imagination. It was not an impossible fantasy, but a reported mystery waiting for its evidence. When fireflies were studied in earnest, or when the ghostly glow of certain fungi was finally documented, these discoveries did not arrive as complete shocks. They felt, in a strange way, like confirmations. The old legends had preserved a vital clue, a long-term observation that science simply lacked the vocabulary to explain at the time. A villager's account of a glowing beast was not a failure of reason, but a triumph of observation. He saw a real event and described it with the best tools he had, a story. That story then bridged the centuries, holding the observation in trust until the day someone with a microscope could finally understand the chemistry behind the light. A dusty manuscript in Baghdad held a diagram of a creature no one had ever seen. This was the engine of a new age. Across the known world, in cities like Toledo and Cordoba, a monumental project was underway. Teams of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scholars worked side by side, not to write new books but to rescue old ones. They were translating the entire knowledge of the ancient world from Greek, Persian, and Sanskrit into Latin and Arabic. This was not a quiet act of preservation. It was a cultural Big Bang. Suddenly, a European monk could read Aristotle's detailed thoughts on biology. A Persian physician could study Galen's medical theories, and an Arab astronomer could scrutinize Ptolemy's star charts. These texts were not dry facts. They were filled with their own legends and mysteries. Aristotle wrote of animals that might exist at the edge of the world, and Ptolemy's maps contained whispers of unknown lands. But now, these ancient stories were no longer isolated tales. They were placed on a vast comparative table. A scholar in Spain could read Aristotle's description of a mythical beast, then compare it to a Persian traveler's account, and then cross-reference it with a local hunter's observation. This forced a critical, evidence-based approach. The legend was no longer just a story to be copied. It was a hypothesis to be tested. This massive recovery of lost knowledge, much of it shrouded in allegory, provided the raw intellectual material for everything that followed. It proved a profound truth about progress. The greatest leaps forward often begin not with a new invention, but with a new translation, with the simple, revolutionary act of asking an old story a new set of questions. Our journey through the medieval imagination uncovers a profound truth. The line between a wild story and a scientific hypothesis was once beautifully thin. Legends were not the enemy of progress, but its essential, fertile soil. From the griffin that guided us to dinosaur fossils to the unicorn's horn that spurred the first anti-poison research, these narratives provided the crucial ingredients for discovery. They offered the raw motivation, the necessary funding, and the creative frameworks that pushed humanity to look closer, to venture further, and to ask the dangerous question, what if? The medieval thinker understood intuitively that to find a new truth, you must first be brave enough to imagine the impossible. They did not see a world divided into fact and fiction, but a unified landscape of wonder where every story held a potential clue. This same spirit is what we need to confront our own monumental challenges, from healing our planet to voyaging among the stars. The next great leap in science, in technology, in our understanding of the universe, will not begin in a sterile vacuum. It will be born from a story, a compelling narrative that captures our collective imagination and dares us to build a future we can currently only dream of. Let these tales of legend-inspired innovation be a reminder. Every revolution in human knowledge starts with a question, and so often, that very first question is whispered in the language of myth. If this fusion of story and discovery has sparked your curiosity, consider subscribing for more journeys into history's hidden connections. We would love to hear from you, so share your own favorite legendary inspiration in the comments below.